We are gathered tonight, however, to talk with Averie Swanson. Averie, this is like the shortest bullet point version of your resume that I can put up here. Averie is a brewer. Averie is a Master Cicerone, one of, I think, 19 in the world, if I remember correctly. Currently founder of Chicago-based Keeping Together, previously of Jester King, as well down in Texas. Averie objectively is one of the smartest people making beer in the world because of that Master Cicerone, but also is widely regarded just as a great human being and a brewer as well. And that is why we get to talk with her tonight to learn more about what she's doing and how that can maybe help us with some of the work that we do too. So Averie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Honestly, like those bullet points are basically sum up everything. So I wish I could just give that to people anytime they ask me about me.
Well, I'm sure we will have many more bullet points to add to that list that people can ask about and learn about tonight. And I actually, where I wanted to start, just because I think, full disclosure, everybody, this is the first time Averie and I are talking face to face, as it were. I've read about you and your work for years. I know people who are on this call and elsewhere who have talked to you and enjoyed your work as well. We've got 3 bullet points, but maybe to allow you to introduce yourself to the group, how would you describe what makes you you?
What a question. Well, first of all, I am super happy to be here and really honored to be here in front of all of you guys. I honestly, it's kind of an intimidating crowd to speak with for me. Let's see, what makes me me? I don't know. I'm just a human that is trying to connect with people and happen to use beer as the medium. I've been brewing for, let's say I started like 2011, I guess, home brewing. Did that for a couple of years. Started volunteering at Jester King in 2013, early 2013. Was there through the end of 2018 before moving up here to Chicago. And yeah, I don't know, that's such a deep and penetrating question.
Brewer and Master Cicerone can only take us so far.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I found really interesting to explore, and maybe kind of, I know, have in the back of my mind as we're chatting tonight, is that the space in which it seems you have great interest, this is mixed culture, barrels, and how all of these things play together. It exists in this very unique space that I imagine is not always easy to communicate to the broad public. The things that you do have a lot of science behind them, had a lot of history and culture there too. So to turn that around into like a 2 or 3 sentence thing that gets them to know you and your beer can be really hard. And along that, there's this parallel that's, again, sitting in the back of my mind, where the way that we cover and write about the beer industry, and especially think about the kind of work that you're doing, can be equally hard, because we're trying to translate and kind of be that funnel to take the things that you're sharing and the way that you think about things, then to also tell them in a compelling way that gets people interested in, as what is in that same fashion as well. So when you do kind of talk to, whether it's other media members or the public at large, about what you do, how is it, like, where do you start from when you talk about this process of doing the kind of brewing that you do?
I mean, it does usually start out with in a pretty elementary way. Most people, especially when speaking with the public, most people are not familiar with mixed culture fermentation. So there's a lot of, like, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with IPAs or Pilsners. There's also sour beer. I'm sure you've probably heard of sour beer. And I kind of jump off of that and then start kind of using, I don't know, examples like yogurt or sauerkraut to try to communicate to people that the type of beer that I'm making is made in a similar way to a lot of the other products that you experience in your day-to-day life that you're consuming probably regularly. This was something that when I was doing tours at Jester King, I talked about this a lot, because people in Austin, in Texas on the whole, we're not familiar with this more like esoteric approach to beer making. But if you tell them, yogurt or kombucha, people are kind of like, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. So as long as you're talking to them about, the kind of yeast and bacteria, it's the symbiotic thing, and it makes beers that have flavors that are pretty familiar to you. So I don't know, I guess for me, I kind of try to target something that I feel like is holistically a bit more approachable or familiar for people. And that usually gets people kind of nodding their heads and understanding. And then beyond that, if people seem interested, I can dig in deeper into the more of the process stuff. But especially when speaking to people in the public, their eyes kind of start to gloss over sooner than later. So it's kind of like, okay.
What is that threshold? Like, where do you start to cross that Rubicon where it's diminishing returns?
Well, as soon as I start to see that, I usually start asking questions, and people get a little bit more engaged at that point, and I can kind of like, okay, you're intrigued by the word bacteria or whatever. I can kind of go more down that rabbit hole. But I'll say that, like, I mean, even to people that are in the beer industry that might not be brewing, the brewing process is a little convoluted, and it's hard to really like wrap your head around if you don't do it yourself. So the brewing process, I try not to go too deep into the weeds when it comes to that, because that people get kind of lost. Fermentation is something else that I feel inherently has kind of this like alchemical or magical type of energy about it, that when you start talking about fermentation, people are like, okay, it's like this very transformative thing. Obviously there's a ton of science that we could dig into with that, but for most people, they're like, okay, I'm familiar with the word fermentation. I understand that alcohol happens with fermentation. I understand that this is something that humans have been doing for, millennia. I think people are pretty interested in the fermentation part of the beer making process. So,
are there typical words that you find successful to connect with a general public when you're talking about fermentation?
That's a good question. I do think that as I begin to kind of talk about like collaboration with the culture that I use, in that it's like, there are lots of different organisms. It's not just one single strain of Saccharomyces that was cultivated in a lab. The culture that I'm using is different than, the yeast you would use to make clean beer, and start kind of talking about how there's lots of different organisms involved, and how it isn't always entirely predictable, that there are these elements of kind of unpredictability and kind of like rogue activity that's happening that I can't always control. And I don't necessarily want to always control those things. I kind of personally really enjoy watching how fermentations will kind of go off on their own thing. And I tend to reserve flexibility in the way that I approach my beer making, such that if a fermentation begins producing flavors that I wasn't expecting, I can change the overall goal and make something different, even though originally I wanted to do something a bit more specific. So people, I think, generally kind of dig that line of thought, in that it's like, okay, well, it's not this very strict process. There is a little bit of deviance and a little bit of, creativity that goes into it. Because I do think that most people are just kind of overwhelmed with the science of the process.
Yeah, this leads me, for those of those members on the call right now who have done and do work for more general audiences too. This might be of particular use for them. What are people most curious about when you go down this path? And if people are coming to you to hear you at the brewery or at an event, there's kind of this built-in expectation that they have that level of interest, but like you're saying, like there's still a threshold of sorts. So what's the feedback that you get when you start asking questions? Like, what really opens them up that they're most curious about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll first of all say that it's been a long time since I've been able to really engage with consumers of the beer that I'm making. I released the first beer, the first Keeping Together beer in December of 2019 here in Chicago. And it's all been kind of pandemic brews since then. So I haven't had a really direct line of communication with consumers in a long time, which is something that I've really missed personally. But also I really enjoy getting the feedback from people as to what they taste in the beer, because it really gives me a lot of insight and opens up my beer experience to hear what other people think about it. But I'll say that when speaking to consumers generally, especially people that clearly don't have a really firm grasp on beer or the industry or the process, I kind of just ask them what was the last thing that they drank that they really enjoyed and why. I think flavor as a whole is something that in the States we don't, obviously the farm to table movement and the slow food movement have grown quite a bit over the last probably 5 or 10 years. But for the most part, like when I go back home in Texas and I talk to my family and I ask them about flavor, they don't have the vocabulary to talk about the things that they eat and drink. So for me, when I talk to people, as soon as they say something like citrus, which is a pretty obvious and kind of on the nose example, they say, oh, I don't know, kind of like citrusy, I guess, like fruity. And it's like, okay, well, what kind of fruit or what kind of citrus? And they're like, I don't know, it's kind of orangey. And you start kind of like just digging in and asking them like for more and more specificity. And people start to kind of get what I'm doing when I start probing in this way. But I think that when you start really engaging people in their personal sensory experience, because it's not something that they're super aware of all the time. And obviously we can't all be aware of it all the time. But when you really engage with them and have a genuine curiosity as to what it is they're experiencing, I think people do tend to open up about that. And then when you do engage them in that way, you can offer vocabulary to them that, they may not have considered to be, defining what it is that they're tasting or experiencing or, smelling or whatever. So.
Yeah, smooth, forever the scourge of beer descriptors, I suppose.
Yeah, or juicy these days.
Well, how do you combat that? Because I think this is also a challenge that even, when I'm talking with friends and peers, guild members here, or just casually, I think even still, like when we understand, I'm looking at that person and we know that we can say something, it's a little geeky and we'll pick it up, but there's still kind of this gut instinct, which maybe is just kind of that American sensibility that you kind of mentioned, where just like you start with something broad and then you have to push people in the direction to get more specificity. And there is a challenge, I guess, for us in a similar way as it is for you, just trying to bring people along that path. Is there, again, like one more question on this, because we could talk about tasting all day, I think. When you find people going down that path, is there something that you think sticks? Like if we focus on things beyond just saying juicy, and rather than saying citrusy, we can get, deeper in the weeds there. Are those things that stick in those conversations you've had, or is you just starting back at square one each time?
I don't know, I think juicy is a good example actually, because when you think about juicy doesn't really elicit any specific flavor in my mind. It's almost more of a like tactile sensation. And when you start talking to people about like how their flavor experience is kind of this combination of primarily aroma, some taste, but also this like very tactile experience that you're having with like liquid over the tissue in your mouth, and you start kind of, I don't know, framing it in a way that most people don't really think about their flavor experience from that perspective. So I think, I don't know, kind of throwing just like random, and perhaps it's not random, but kind of approaching it from a very like left field position. People don't necessarily experience or don't necessarily expect that. And so they're kind of taken aback and are almost forced to pause before they really can continue the conversation. Because you can talk about flavor words, especially when it comes to like fruit. And people are like, yeah, I know what that fruit is. But when you really start breaking down exactly what that flavor experience consists of, you get into territory that most people are not totally comfortable And some people do shut down, but a lot of people are kind of like, that's really interesting, and they open up. At least that's been my experience.
Is it easy to use the word saison?
Oh man, I find I use it a lot. I don't know, I did the Saison Day talk yesterday with Allagash and some other people who I really respect in the industry. And we all have kind of different ideas or definitions of what Saison is. For me, and I didn't get too deep into this yesterday, but it's almost more of like a philosophical approach to beer making than it is a specific style. One of the reasons why I went through the pain that was my Cicerone journey. Stevie was actually one of my test administrators, my proctors, like several times. So he watched me suffer through this. Oh man, I totally lost my train of thought because I'm talking about Stevie.
Well, what I'm gonna do real quick is I'm going to, just to give a sense. So we're looking at the page right now and keeping together kind of this.
Everything is Saison.
Yeah. So and I also, spoiler alert. This is something that fellow writer Jeff Allworth published recently, which I thought was really interesting. Just for those who haven't read it yet, the question, which I think he realizes is what it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but also has some seriousness to it. What if we called them Farmhouse IPA? The them is saison, or at least American saison. Which I think again speaks to the difficulty both in terms of the public's understanding and interest in it. So looking at some of the things that you're releasing recently, saison with oranges, Earl Grey tea and saffron, black locust honey. You have your table saison, a 3% ABV saison, which sound delicious to me. But like, how do you talk about saison, which can be a very broad, esoteric thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So honestly, I don't hate the term farmhouse. I think that from a marketing perspective and from a consumer education perspective, it's a really useful term in that it is a very evocative term. It helps people understand that what they're going to be drinking has a little bit more rusticity to it, which is also a challenging term because it's hard to define really. And the way that I kind of define it when I do start talking to people is like it has a certain type of texture to it. It's a little bit rougher around the edges. It's not, super clean and succinct from a flavor perspective. It's got texture to it because you're using ingredients that tend to have a little bit more texture to them. They're not, if you're able to work with a local craft maltster or who hopefully is getting grain locally or, at least grain that's grown on a smaller scale, you're not getting mass produced, really homogenized ingredients for that style. You're using raw wheat or spelt or rye or whatever. So these ingredients have a little bit more texture to them. And as a beer maker, I'm using those ingredients intentionally, and I want to retain some of that texture in the final product. So when I talk to people about saison, it is kind of this like, I have the entire palette of flavor available to me to make beer with. But there is and you could find a lot of those flavors in other styles. You can find a lot of the flavors that I'm trying to create in my saison in IPA. I'm using similar ingredients. But what I feel like IPA lacks that saison provides is this more, and I know that I've said texture like 10 times already, but it is this like more textural, tactile kind of beverage experience.
This came up in a conversation we had with Heather Turner and Jesse Bissard a couple months ago, talking about malt. And it sounds like what you're saying is similar to something that came up in that conversation, where the challenge of talking about malt, in this case specifically saison, is that the storytelling, to tell that story for the public, means you have to find specific connections. And to me, it sounds like that connection for you is agriculture and the way that you can bring, the birth of that beer to life gives you kind of that path to talk to somebody about a saison or a style that they probably never heard about.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And in talking about the agriculture, you can't talk about it without talking about the farmers. I think that relating it back to the people that are responsible for making or for growing the food that we eat, the same ingredients that go into the beer that we make and drink, those farming is incredibly intensive manual labor. And I think most people in the general public can appreciate that as a fact. So to talk to them about the farmer that grew this cared a lot about this product. They poured their heart and soul into growing this thing so that it was the best possible agricultural product it could be. And it gets handed off to a maltster and they pour their heart and soul into it to create this thing that goes to a distiller, to a baker, to a brewer, whatever. And as a beer maker, I do feel like it is a great responsibility to try to preserve the passion and the love that went into those ingredients throughout that entire process. And I do think that that resonates with people.
I'm going to flag that for everybody too, because I think if this comes up in more than one conversation, this idea of farmers and their connection to beer as stories that maybe aren't often told, that's like, there's a flag that's going up in the back of my head for those who are listening now, thinking about potential stories to tell. Averie, are you able to drop any names of farmers that you've worked with that have been, good partners or impressive in what they're doing and what's helped create some things for you?
Yeah, honestly, here in Illinois, well, Caleb, I'm going to butcher his last name, but he's the owner of Sugar Creek Malting in Lebanon, Indiana. So it's about maybe 3-hour drive from Chicago. And his family, like multi-generational farmers, and just within the last generation, I guess, he started this malting company out there. His dad and his dad lives on the property and they're growing rye and then barley, and they've got like a beautiful heirloom. It's an heirloom Czech barley that they're starting to grow out there too. So he's working, he's just like attacking it from all sides, which I think is incredible. He like lives and breathes the malt. I went out there not that long ago and the facility is super cool. I've been to lots of craft malt facilities across the country, and some of them are really, really nice and really like state of the art technology. And then some of them are very much not that. And it is very like, repurposed dairy equipment and everything is like spray foam insulation. And Caleb seems to care less about making sure everything looks really good and just like making really incredible malt. His dad is growing it. He's helping grow it. And I've been able to work with him on several beers. He's doing all kinds of really cool smoked malt also. And I know that that's not necessarily everybody's favorite ingredient, but it is something that I really love. And I've been trying to make smoked beer, the new IPA, for like 2 or 3 years now, but it will catch eventually. But we did like a lavender smoked, he did a lavender smoked barley for me. And he was like, I can only do like, if I'm going to do a batch of this, it's like 330 pounds. I can't really do less than that. And I was like, okay, so I guess I'm going to buy 330 pounds of lavender smoked malt, which is a lot. When you're making smoked beer, you don't necessarily need a ton of smoked malt. A little goes a long way. But I ended up making this beer that was like almost 80% smoked malt. And I think it tastes pretty cool. It has very much this like mezcal margarita thing going on. Like the floral character is still there, but it has this like awesome kind of ashy, like almost like terracotta type of smoke character to it that I really enjoy. So anyway, he's willing to do all kinds of weird stuff. He's like barrel aging malt out there in pretty small quantities. He's got the cold smoker. He's got a roaster. He's doing a like traditional Scandinavian sign house floor smoking malt. So he's doing some really, really cool stuff and is open to all kinds of weird ideas and really just like hand making all of it.
Mad scientist of malting. almost,
Yes.
sounds like. Headline for anybody who wants it. Is there a non-malt farmer that you've worked with in the past that you've had good partnership with?
Back down in Austin, there was a farm that I worked pretty closely with called La Flaca, and it was actually just like a 1 acre, like it was in a suburb of Austin, and it was this couple, and they had basically retrofitted their backyard to grow all kinds of cool stuff, and so I worked with them on a couple different things. They were growing some pretty weird. Um, the woman there, I want to say her mom was from interior Mexico somewhere, and so she had all kinds of really cool like Mexican herbs. I'm trying to think. I can't remember the name of the one that I used. I did like a michelada inspired beer. I wish I could remember the name of the herb, but it was something I had never even heard of before, and she had some of it, and she was like, I mean, no one's like buying it because it's kind of this weird thing. It's kind of like almost like oregano, but a little bit more like lime leaf. Um, I'm so upset that I can't remember the name of it, but she was a lot of fun to work with. And, it was one of those things where it's like, she would tell me what she had a lot of that wasn't really selling, or that, would end up going into the compost bin. And I'd be like, man, I would, if you're just going to like toss it, I'd be happy to give you like a certain, a small amount of money for this thing that you would otherwise be throwing away, and I can turn that into something else down the line. So that was a relationship that I really enjoyed down there. I would say generally too, just for me as a beer maker, I really like the kind of like resource dependent recipe development. Like even at Half Acre here, where I'm kind of in residence, making Keeping Together beer, I will regularly like reach out to the production manager there and just be like, what kind of leftover bags of grain do you have that you don't really have purpose for? And I can kind of turn that into something else. And I find that farmers really appreciate that approach because they are very resource minded themselves. And I would imagine that it's kind of heartbreaking to like grow all this stuff, and if people aren't buying it, or if it's like it's gone to flower, it's gone to seed, and I can't really like sell this like basil or something, you can kind of spin the story a little bit differently, and like all of a sudden basil flowers are really expensive because they're used as a garnish at like a linea. So yeah, I don't know. I've been very grateful to get to work with farmers in a few different places at this point.
I
So.
think you may have successfully answered this question. Jesse had written in ahead of time asking what you think about craft malt. It sounds like you were very excited about it.
I am a huge, very excited about it. And, back down in Texas, I worked with Blacklands, Brandon over at Blacklands, who was working closely with Texas A&M and like trying to get farmers to grow different types of, barley is not an insured crop in Texas and in various other places. So it's a huge risk on the farmers to even consider growing some of these grains. So I really appreciated the work that Brandon was doing down in Texas to try to get people on board with craft malt and just, growing barley or wheat generally. Worked closely with Tim Gormley out at Burial Brewing, who's a phenomenal beer maker and is working really closely with several different maltsters. He did like a collaborative project where with, I don't know, probably like 8 or 10 different breweries. And all of us did like a different lager with him and our respective craft maltster and his maltster out there, Riverbend Malt. I've tried to like link up Brandon at Blacklands with other maltsters and been like, you guys should do a collaboration together, and then I'll make a beer with that collaborative malt and it'll be, whatever. But yeah, it's I really love that people are putting more energy and effort and excitement into development of the ingredients before they even get to us, because as brewers, because I think there's a lot that can be done that's really exciting and really just adds to the story and therefore adds to the consumer's experience, which at the end of the day is what we're all doing this for.
Kate, that actually dovetails very nicely with a question that Kate had. she said that she's heard brewers regularly cite Keeping Together as one of the most important American breweries making Saison today. And she was curious what breweries are inspiring you with their Saison brew.
Man, it warms my heart to hear that people feel that way. Oh man, I don't know. I think that like Oxbow up in Maine is doing some pretty incredible stuff, and I geek out every time I can get my hands on those bottles. Outside of the US, De La Seine is probably up there within my top 5 favorite breweries and favorite beer makers and favorite beers. Oberon in France, technically on the label, it doesn't say Saison, it says Bière de Garde, but they're pale Bière de Garde, so they're about as close to as a Saison as you can get. Sante Darius, their beers are always really, really beautiful. I've enjoyed those a lot. Honestly, here in Chicago, is doing really cool stuff too. Mike is a brilliant guy, and I always really enjoy trying his beers and chatting with him. I would say, honestly, there's a lot of Saison out there that, you know, people are making it because they feel like they need it on their menu, I guess, and not necessarily making it because it's something that they're passionate about. And this, like, you can taste it.
What do you mean by that? What do you taste or
I
not
think,
taste?
say that again.
What do you taste or not taste when you think about that?
I don't know. I think that there's, and I don't want to sound, I don't know, pretentious about it, I guess, but like when you're using lab cultivated yeast and you're like following the rules and you're doing everything the way that, you know, the brewer on the Zoom call tells you to, you end up making beer that tastes very similar. And for me, that style is really the most natural conduit for the local ingredients. And so when you're using, I don't know, the mass produced ingredients to create this like pretty industrial beer, I don't know, it lacks, to me, it lacks a little bit of soul, I guess. I know that that's not like a really tangible like flavor descriptor, but I don't know, for me, like it doesn't always have the texture that I'm looking for. Like I want Saison to be like fluffy, and I want there to be some friction, and I want there to be a little bit of like flaw to it.
I would love to know more about that. And I'm going to flag this as for everybody too, as what might be an interesting tension to at least think about, but then maybe explore or talk with people down the line. Because it sounds like there's this push pull that I'm hearing from you where on one side, it's the rules of brewing, which can create a objectively effective beer style like Saison, but it might not have the soul you're talking about. And on the other side, there's this tradition of the unknown where to get to that spot, I think I hear you talking about, you have to let yourself go a little bit and hope for the best. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah. And honestly, this ties back to the thing that I totally lost my train of thought on earlier. One of the like major motivators for me in going through the Cicerone program and the certification process and getting to master level is that I didn't want people to tell me that I was making beer this way because I didn't know any better. I very much wanted people to understand, or at least to prove to myself and to prove to anybody else that may be questioning this, that like, I know what the current convention is for what this style is supposed to be. I know that there are like style parameters, and I can cite those for you. But at the end of the day, I am making the beer that I am making very intentionally, and it's not supposed to be perfect and by the book. And I do think that in the States, that's like a mentality or an attitude that has been embraced in the past. Whether it's always been a positive thing or not is a different discussion. But I think at the end of the day, you do have to let yourself go a little bit and kind of explore outside of the box to see what exists out there and what the possibilities are. And I do think that Saison is a really forgiving style for doing that. I've never really considered myself to be a creative person up until probably within the last couple of years, whereas like okay, I just never found my medium. And beer very much allows me to, it like fulfills the science nerd that lives inside me, but it also provides this really awesome kind of safe space to explore flavor and elicit different emotional responses from people through their flavor experience, which I think is the whole point of art generally.
Flavor experience is a term that Jason Perkins brought up in a conversation that we had a couple months ago. When you say flavor experience, what does that mean to you?
I mean, it's everything from looking at a beer menu, selecting a beer, having it brought to you, or picking it out of a cooler, opening it, like the feel of the bottle in your hand, the sound of the can opening or the bottle popping, the sound of it pouring into your glass. It is this like multimodal sensory experience. It's everything. Taste is a very specific sensory input into your brain. Aroma, similarly. Most of your flavor experience is the flavor experience is aroma generally, but there's just so much more to it, and your brain does all of this for you. You're not necessarily conscious of all of it, but when you choose to become conscious of these things or aware of them, it really just like expands and lengthens your experience in the moment, and that I think is exciting.
Is that found within those rules that you try to bend when you talk about flavor experience and the fact that maybe there's some challenge professionally and creatively if you're being told, well, you need to brew it this way? That brewing to this idea of flavor experience is what excites you most?
Yeah, I would say so. I don't know. For me, it is, I don't know. It's a hard question to answer. I would say that yes, I am very much trying to brew for a flavor experience. But at the end of the day, every person's flavor experience is completely different because of all the memories that you've had as a human. So though I might try to create a very specific sense memory or recreate a very specific sense memory in a beer and share that with somebody and be like, this is what, my life was like when I would ride my bike to swim team practice in the morning in the summer, and that person would smell it. And though I was trying to recreate the sense of like fresh cut grass and like dew and whatever, they might smell it and be like, yeah, this reminds me of spending my evenings after school stuck in the front yard mowing the lawn because my mom or dad made me do that. So it's a very different flavor experience at that point. It's not necessarily a positive one because of their memories. Something that I was actually talking to my partner about not that long ago, it was kind of like a weird aha moment to me, was like, it's perfectly acceptable within the realm of audiovisual art to elicit emotions of sadness or anger. But when it comes to flavor, you're not supposed to feel those things. You're not supposed to get mad at what you're drinking, or it's not supposed to make you feel angry or frustrated. But I don't necessarily see why not. This is something that I have thought a fair amount about recently, and I don't know how I would go, like, how do you explain that to somebody? Like, this is what frustration tastes like to me. And like, how do you translate that?
Malort, is that?
Yeah, Malort is a singular experience that I can't even talk. The last hangover I had was because of Malort, and I can't even with that right now.